Hello, my friends. I'm back. So good to be back with you, and let's talk about some news. So, today I wanted to talk to you about not just the recent week news, but also like more general trends that I have observed during this year, specifically about tariffs and sanctions. And the reason why I want to talk to you about this is because a lot of people I talk to, and you may agree or disagree, but I had this impression that neither sanctions nor tariffs make any sense. And the reason why they don't make any sense is because they don't bring the result or the outcome that they're supposed to bring. And when I talk to people and like my peers and some other people working in the industry, we're like, why are they doing this? Don't they see that this is inefficient? And we end up almost always in the territory of psychology and psychiatry instead of like law, regulations, and finance, which is interesting. So essentially, the reason why I feel that sanctions and tariffs haven't been particularly efficient during the last year because the assumptions behind them, the philosophy, the intentions, and also the interpretation of the world by people who impose these initiatives are not accurate. Let's put it that way. So here's my theory. Essentially, I do feel that US and the concept of like America is very much based on this assumption that America is this leading dominant power. It is the, city on the hill, and it is very much linked to prosperity and financial success. Like America doesn't necessarily want to be like culturally better or intellectually more like sophisticated. I mean, I'm not saying people, I'm kind of trying to interpret the idea of the nation and of like a state. But America definitely wants to be most powerful and the richest, and essentially, as a result of this, be able to tell people what to do. And when, let's say, a particular government or particular president impose tariffs or try to impose tariffs or try to tell Brazil or India or China or some other country what they should do, and this other country doesn't do it, and they're like, well, that's interesting that you have this opinion, but we have our own path, we have our own strategy. Like, go pound sand. Americans really don't understand it. They have a cognitive dissonance. And when somebody feels like it should be working, I have a like, right, I am the best, I'm the richest, I'm the most powerful, I have the biggest economy. Everybody should be wanting to trade with me. And when people don't do it, they obviously see that they have done something ineffective, but instead of rethinking the origin story, they just double down. That's why we have more tariffs, additional tariffs, we have secondary tariffs, whatever tariffs. And when tariffs don't work, we just go to war with Venezuela and directly take, the oil assets. It's no longer about the drug trafficking. Like, it's been very clear that it's all about resources and control over resources. I mean, at least this is a bit more honest and we see kind of what's going on. So, my interpretation of the tariffs attempts is that America sees that life in America and prosperity of American people and even success of American companies are no longer the best, the fastest, the most like prominent. There are other countries that are doing significantly better in some areas, or let's say in case of AI, China is able to deliver models almost as good, but not as expensive. And because of that, like there is this American cognitive dissonance, and they're trying to overcome this and get to the place where they're the richest, the most powerful, the most strong military through tariffs and more recently, like through direct intervention. Europe is different. Europe is not so much about like forceful dominance and more about intellectual dominance. And I mean, the most, I would say, important or relevant symbol of that is Europe loves the idea that it gives, let's say, Nobel Prizes in history, in literature, and in peace and whatever. Like, Europe likes the idea of being able to decide what is right, what is wrong, what is the best, what are the highest standards, right? So it is still like a desire or aspiration to dominate, but it is more in the sphere of intellect and theories instead of like directly going to war, hopefully. Like, you never know. So anyway, and that's why I feel like Europe is more doubling down on sanctions and less so on tariffs. Like, actually, Europe lost completely their trade competition with the US and gave in, like, not a great story, but that's a story for another day. So excuse me. So I was following this story of sanctions and Europe during this year, and obviously last week has been like very important week because finally they made the decision about this frozen Russian assets. If you don't know the story, essentially this year Europe has imposed 3 new sanction packages in relation to Russia. No, 4. Like 4 complete packages between 16 and 19, and now they're working on number 20. So every 2 months we have a new draft of a sanction package. Yeah, what does it tell you when you have like 19 sanction packages and you feel like you need number 20? Something was obviously missing in your previous like 19 attempts. But anyway, so this week there was a huge, I would say there were 2 important events in relation to sanctions. Let's first talk about the assets. So the idea was that Europe has this frozen assets of Russia as a state. There are also assets that belong to the individuals or companies, and they remain frozen. But there was this idea that the assets that belong to the Russia as a state, the Russian central bank, could be like repurposed, because I'm trying to find the right way how to define it, and I cannot really say appropriated or reused or whatever, because it doesn't really define the underlying legal flow. So what happens when something is sanctioned? The property of the asset still remains with whoever is sanctioned. In this particular case, this is the property of Russia as a sovereign state. And what has been tried is, since like Russia is evil, it's not cooperative, it's not giving in, and Europe doesn't have its own money, there was an attempt to figure out a legal, quote unquote, way how to use these assets and give these assets to Ukraine so that Europe is still able to help Ukraine, but doesn't need to go more into debt. So that was the original idea. And first, the idea was, let's just take it directly and give it to Ukraine. This didn't work because essentially in Europe, if you want to take away somebody's property, you could do it in 2 ways. Either you have a contract or you have the decision of the court. And arguably, you could technically go to the court and say that these property rights have been, transferred from this entity to that entity. But you have to have some reasons to do that. And probably they didn't find any court that would agree to do that. So then they wanted to go into a different route and say the property of the assets would remain with Russia. However, we use this asset as a collateral and we give a loan to Ukraine guaranteed by these assets, and Ukraine would only have to pay back the loan once they receive reparations from Russia, which we don't know if or when it's ever going to happen. And they tried to create consensus about it for several months. They went to different institutions, and what was, I would say, striking is first they went to the European Central Bank. European Central Bank said don't do it because it would undermine stability of the European financial system. It would undermine trust to our institutions from Chinese or Arabic or other investors, and it also could create additional domino effect with like assets of the European institutions, let's say in Asia, in Singapore, in China, in Hong Kong, in other financial centers. So ECB said, don't do it, because they don't really see how they can survive this without serious negative consequences. And the reason why I'm saying that it's not like theoretical threat that there would be serious consequences, because when Switzerland in 2022, for the first time ever, joined sanctions that are not approved by the UN Security Council. Okay, maybe a step back. So sanctions could be imposed by any country. The country can decide, I want to sanction my neighbor or somebody around the globe. They can totally do it by local law. But what makes sanctions enforceable is if they follow the protocol described in the UN Charter. And the UN Charter says that in case of like a serious military or like violent dispute, UN can organize itself and impose sanctions, embargoes, and other things on other countries if the UN Security Council approves that. And then this entity, if it's approved, is entered into like a specific list. It is called like UN sanction list, and a lot of terrorists, a lot of like bad players are on that list. It's a very long list. So UN knows how to implement that. But this specific package against Russia was never on the UN list, because obviously Russia and China are permanent members and they would have vetoed that. So it wasn't even tried. So these sanctions are kind of like sanctions imposed by, let's say, OFAC or EU, but they're not supported by the UN. So there is a difference. Anyway, so Switzerland, as a neutral country, only in the past supported sanctions that were approved by the UN, because it felt that if UN approved specific sanctions, then it is a neutral decision. There is a consensus in the world about, this specific actor. And therefore, Switzerland would join these sanctions without losing its status of a neutral country. However, in 2022, Switzerland, for the first time, joined sanctions against Russia. I think it was on day 4. So it was a very quick decision. It was like a very unanimous decision. So there was not even a contradiction about that. So there were some people talking about it, but really it was an obvious decision for many people in Switzerland. But what happened after is that obviously not only Switzerland lost Russian assets that were like, there was plenty of Russian money in Switzerland, but also over time, they measured that investors from other countries reduced their holdings or assets under management in Switzerland. And when there was a report by the International Monetary Fund that compared situation in Switzerland in 2022 and 2023, they measured that and they said that the total impact on Switzerland was a loss of asset under management of foreign direct investments. I don't remember the metric. That is about 6 to 7% of Swiss GDP. So it was a big number. I have to make one caveat and say that during 2023, there was a huge scandal in Switzerland in relation to the bankruptcy of Credit Suisse. So that story also contributed to, I would say, overall distrust of foreign investors and how people viewed Switzerland. So, and it's hard to differentiate because it kind of happened at the same time. But still, we do have numerical evidence that when you, I would say, take action against somebody who keeps money with you, every other investor that keeps money with you gets nervous and they may reduce their exposure because your behavior or your policies are viewed like as not very predictable. So that was that. So ECB said don't do it. But then even International Monetary Fund said that this is a stretch, don't do it. They have a different reason because there are some like regulations. I'm not like an international lawyer, so I don't know all the details, but my main takeaway from the recommendation of the International Monetary Fund was that they need to maintain stability around sovereign assets, and I would say the immunity of the sovereign assets, because otherwise other countries that are interacting with the International Monetary Fund would potentially question whether they should give money to this, whether they should sponsor some programs, whether they trust it. Like, so they anticipated an impact at their level, so the relationship between sovereign countries, and they also said don't do it. And then like until I believe the decision was taken this Thursday, so just 2 days ago, and until then, European Union Commission, like European Commission specifically, and some leaders of a few countries still tried to do it. They were still pushing, and I mean, I have a question, because if you remember, in 2010 and 11, there were similar like discussions whether or not like European Union or European Central Bank should give money to Greece and Cyprus to essentially save them. And there was a huge opposition, specifically from Germany, but also from many others, about that. And when European Union finally decided to give, they finally decided they didn't give money to Cyprus, and there were several people in Cyprus who lost their money and lost their deposits because there was a run on the bank. And with Greece, they gave money to Greece, but they also imposed a lot of control measures where essentially officials from the European Commission and from the European Central Bank and from other ministries, they were physically present in Greece. They were sitting within different departments and agencies in Greece, trying to monitor how this money given to Greece are going to be spent. And on the top of that, Greece was forced to rebalance its budget and reduce some salaries of the government officials and reduce some governmental programs. You may remember this word, austerity measures. So that is what was kind of imposed on Greece. Essentially, people said, okay, we'll give you the money, but there are strings attached, and there were heavy strings. And I remember even like a lot of Greece people said that these decisions were imposed by so-called troika, and troika is a Russian word that originates from the times of Stalin, where essentially troika meant there were three persons who were making decisions who will be executed and who would be sent to Gulag and who is the enemy of the people, so to speak. So it wasn't like it's not a pleasant metaphor. Let's put it that way. So anyway, and then I started thinking, okay, so European Union really wants to give this money to Ukraine, which I understand because Ukraine is in a very desperate position right now. But if you want to give this money to Ukraine and you feel like you're morally justified, just do it. Why do you need to create the schemes and the collateral and the linkages to the reparation loans? If you feel you're right and you don't care about consequences, just do what you want to do and stop pretending that this is some kind of legal scheme. Or if you want to take this money because you feel like Russia is a bad actor and Europe has the right to decide what to do with these funds, shouldn't we at least consider how this money should be spent? For example, a lot of people say that, and even my kids, they say that it's very difficult for young people to find jobs that pay well enough to afford housing in big cities, and they don't want to create children. And now we have the stories that Volkswagen in Germany and some other factories are closing down because they are unprofitable because of the high energy cost. And we have all these issues related to farming because fertilizers are super expensive and farming is not profitable. So we have a lot of problems. And if we really want to take Russian assets, at least shouldn't we consider like maybe we should build nuclear power plants, or we should subsidize energy, or we should subsidize farming, or we should subsidize whatever other. I'm not saying all money should go into one direction, but at least consider what is the best use of this money if you want to take it. And secondly, it was recognized just 15 or maybe 12 years ago in case of Greece that when you give money to somebody, you have to impose some controls around how this money is spent. I'm not saying that what was done to Greece is the best practice, but the principle is reasonable. When you give money to somebody, you should have like some controls over how this money is spent, especially if you're taking a lot of risks doing that. And I haven't heard any stories on the European side as to how they would want to make sure that the money is spent, I would say, on things that are reasonable. So like no audits, no nothing. And mind you, there is a huge corruption scandal and the golden toilet situation going on in Ukraine. So I'm not exactly inflating this risk. There is a risk of money potentially being misspent. And with all of that, on Thursday, European Union decided, okay, we don't have enough support to take the Russian assets and repurpose these assets for Ukraine or something else. So the Russian assets are still sitting there waiting for their destiny. And of course, partially, I feel it's good in a sense that it doesn't create the situation where financial markets would panic and euro would lose its value and investors would start taking money from like European institutions. So in that sense, it preserved some kind of stability of like a European financial industry for now, even though they say they will get back to this idea. But then they decided, okay, we're going to take this loan and we're going to give the loan to Ukraine. But my point is, there are still no, as far as I see, conditions around how to spend this money or how to audit or who is going to control it or whatever, right? So this is where I see like a problem, because they did it for much smaller amount for Greece, and now it would make sense. Because in this case, this money is not coming from the Russian assets, it's coming from the European taxpayers. So that's the point. And broadly speaking, I do feel like the idea and the story of the Russian sanctions this year is symbolic because it illustrates one point, which is Europe doesn't spend money in a rational way. And the reason why I say this, because it doesn't make economic sense, it doesn't make sense from the prudential perspective, and it doesn't even make sense in terms of following your own laws. And the entire story of these Russian assets is in the area of psychology and psychiatry. Because Europe is trying to figure out what is the moral thing to do and kind of loses track of how you should make decisions about money. Because if you want to give a grant and you never expect this grant to be returned, yeah, you could give a grant to wherever and feel generous about it. If you call it a loan, there are completely different, I would say, restrictions and controls that should be applicable for, I would say, a loan agreement. And European Union is refusing to apply these conditions, even though it expects all other financial institutions giving loans or receiving loans to follow certain steps. And that's not good. It's not best practice. It kind of ruins the core principles of how we as compliance professionals have been taught to look at economic substance of financial transactions. That's kind of my biggest issue with how European Union handled the Russian assets. And if this wouldn't be enough, we have another story, because on Monday, European Union added a few people to the sanctioned list for spreading Russian propaganda. I believe there were about 20 people. The names of many of them don't tell me anything. I don't know who they are, except for one person. One guy, his name is Jacques Beau, and he's a Swiss national, and he's 70 years old, like, just saying. So the guy was serving in the Swiss military, and then he was working for different international organizations. He was helping with a lot of international conflicts in Africa, and he was part of different UN programs in relation to guns controls. And at some point, he was viewed as one of the leading experts in the world with respect to negotiating with rebels in Africa. So he had a meaningful career, kind of trying to resolve international conflicts. Then his last several years, he worked for NATO. He, I understand, lived in Brussels, and then he retired. So the guy, like, just say, the guy is 70. And he wrote a dozen of books on different aspects of international relationships and international conflicts. So he's considered like an expert in certain fields. And I heard a couple of his interviews on various podcasts, not just about like Russia, Ukraine, but generally speaking about international relationships and how people try to use force versus diplomacy to resolve conflicts. That's his area of expertise. To me, he sounded very thoughtful and balanced and, not sensational. So this guy was sanctioned on Monday. And if you don't know, when somebody is sanctioned, their life is ruined forever, because his name is entered into various like sanctioned list. So like the World Check, the LexisNexis, the databases, it means that all his bank accounts are frozen, his cards would stop working, everybody who sends money to him or receives money from him would be flagged. He won't be able to board a plane, he cannot travel. So, and it's forever, because there is no legitimate way how you could appeal this decision, right? And all he did was talk on podcasts and express his opinion using Western sources, not even Russian sources. He didn't like say, or he didn't distribute information from like Kremlin.ru. He simply provided analysis or historical comparisons, and he gave an assessment of what may happen or what may work or what may not work. That's all. Like, and it's not like he's not a journalist, right? So he has spent his entire career serving the institutions that are currently, in his opinion, not making the best decisions. And his life is ruined for like ever. I mean, I don't know him. I just heard a couple of his interviews, but I feel that this is so unfair. This is so outrageous. And the reason why I'm saying this, speaking of Troika, because this is exactly the type of law that existed in the Soviet Union where I grew up. We had this criminal penalty that was something to the effect spreading anti-Soviet propaganda or helping enemy forces to disseminate information that is damaging for the Soviet Union. So it was a thought crime. And you would go, it was one of the harshest penalties. You would go to prison in the Soviet Union for that. And at least in the Soviet Union, you would need to be judged by, like in the court, you would be presented with like a lawyer. So it was a formality, but still there was a process of how these decisions are made. Speaking of Troika, right? And in this case, these decisions are made by the European Council, but I believe the European Council made the decision when the original law was introduced that we will sanction now people and entities who spread Russian propaganda. And at the time, they added like RT and like other Russian media to the sanction list. But when you add additional names to this law, the scrutiny and the requirement of unanimous vote are less. Like you don't have the same level of discussion and you don't need the same level of consensus when you add names to this list. And there is no way to appeal. There is no way to present your arguments. You don't even know this is going to happen. And essentially your life is ruined forever. And the reason why I am so appalled to this idea is because that's freaking why I left Russia to begin with. I thought in Europe we respect people and we are fair and we are thoughtful and we are not impulsive, especially when it comes to people who are not violent, who are not like terrorists, who are not drug traffickers, who have a meaningful career and like convincing track record of trying to be a good citizen and serve the Western world order, so to speak. This is like ridiculous. Well, anyway, so that's me ranting. What I wanted to say is that the same way how I feel that the American efforts to reinstate their dominance using force is not going to work, because the original source of American success was the prosperity of the people and the health of the economy. And that's no longer the case. That's why they're failing. because like dollar is not that important, financial system dominated by the US is not important, the US tariffs and sanctions are not that consequential. So yeah, welcome to the world where you're no longer the most important country. And on the other hand side, in the European case, this, I would say, attempts to stretch the laws and try to attempt to define who is a bad person and who needs to be outlawed and who needs to be put on the sanction lists. These attempts also are not going to be successful. That's why we need the package number 20, because the previous 19s obviously weren't enough. But also it undermines the legality and the stability of the European Union as a construct. Like European Union is a creation of laws and consensus and agreements and like diplomacy, because it's not something that grew organically. People were joining treaties were updated, there was certain mechanism like and powers of different bodies created. So if we have this construct, European Union, which is a legal construct, and you are undermining the consensus mechanism for this construct, you're doing something that is super detrimental and kind of killing you from inside. So anyway, that's what I have to say about tariffs and sanctions. Let me know what you think. I am very curious to, hear different opinions, because I don't feel like I obviously know everything. I'm just an observer here. But my observation is that these things are not going to go into, like, these things are not going to produce the results that people want. It just creates more lying and deception and more aggression and more impulsive, obsessive decisions. And we're back into the area of psychiatry and psychology. Anyway, have a wonderful weekend. If you're celebrating Christmas or Hanukkah, like, make sure you have wonderful holidays. I will be back with more analysis in the next few days, but now, like, let's chill out and have a good time. Bye.